Hi, welcome to part 1 of this video series. Today I want to show you how to tackle the unseen poetry section of the English Literature Paper 2. This video focuses on annotating an unseen poem in just 5 minutes in preparation for the 24-mark answer. Let's start by taking a look at what to expect from the exam paper. You'll be given a poem and will be asked to answer a 24-mark question about it. You'll then be given another poem and be asked an 8-mark question, which will require you to compare the two poems. I'm going to run through a real-life exam paper for this video series, and the next two videos focuses on how to construct the 24-mark and 8-mark answers, and you can find the links to these in the description box below. Let's get started. Before we look at the poem, I want to take you through the steps to analyse the poem in just 5 minutes. Firstly, you should read the poem. Then you should take a minute to understand the poem, and at this stage you should be aiming for at least a literal interpretation. Next, annotate the poem to highlight any poetic devices that you spot, make notes about the structure and form, and highlight any interesting language features. Now it's time to take a look at the question, and in relation to the question, start by seeing how the title might relate to it. Since you have a good idea at this stage of what the poem is about, and you have annotated it, think about possible alternative meanings. AO1 requires you to explore these. And finally, you won't get any marks for simply identifying the writer's methods that refer to step number 3, so you should consider what impact they have on the poem, on its meaning and the reader. So let's see each of these steps in action. If you want, you can take a pen and paper and get ready to work through this with me. Step 1 is to read the poem. Here is the one we're going to look at. Press pause on the video to take a couple of minutes to read it. Now let's form a quick sentence to describe what is happening. Again, press pause if you would like to give it a go. In just a second, I'll show you a sample answer. Here it is. On the surface, we can say that in this poem, the poet is describing what the season of autumn feels and looks like to him. Step 3 is to annotate the poem, and we're going to start by looking at the poetic devices. The poet uses a simile to compare autumn to an experienced robber. Since the language used in the rest of the poem continues this comparison, we could say that the robber is being used as an extended metaphor. We also notice some alliteration, and the repetition of the G and K sounds creates quite a harsh tone. Next, we can spot some repetition, in this case of the word wind. And in line 11, we see that the poet uses some gentle sibilance, that is, the repetition of the S sound. And finally, in the ending, we can see some juxtaposition of the words placid and rage. There is, of course, a lot of imagery and figurative language also used in this poem. Now let's take a look at the structure. It is just one stanza in length, and there is no notable rhyme scheme or rhythmic pattern. In fact, the structure isn't very controlled at all. Focusing now on the form, as mentioned earlier, it is one stanza in length. Since there is no noticeable rhyming or rhythmic patterns, we could say that it has been written in free verse. Now, in some ways, it reminds us of a dramatic monologue, as there is an intensity of feeling. However, we can't identify it with this form, since we can't be clear whether the speaker is the poet or not. Also, dramatic monologues are typically designed to reveal character traits, which this poem does not do. When talking about the form, we could also say that it's like the opposite of an ode. An ode is typically a dedication to something or someone, and is often filled with love. This poem, however, is a dedication to autumn, but it is not filled with feelings of love. Now let's annotate the poem with a focus on language. There is generally a negative tone that is created by the language choices, and it ends with anger, with the word rage. The poem contains a lot of figurative language, and there are a lot of sensory descriptions. We can also identify a lot of movement and imagery, and as mentioned earlier, we can see how experienced robber is being used as a metaphor. Now, although there is a lot of figurative language, which is language that's not to be taken literally, the language itself is quite simple and direct. We see a major focus on nature in this poem, and although we do not know when this poem was written, this is a typical trait of Romantic poetry. As we analyse the language, we can pick out some interesting words. For instance, chaos accurately describes how we sense that the speaker is feeling. We sense that he's feeling out of control. And the poet also chooses to describe the sky as glowing red, which connotes anger, and this is enhanced with the final word rage. Red also reminds us of danger. Moving on to step 4 now, we need to read the question. I always suggest highlighting key words in the question, as this can help you stay focused when constructing your answer. Here we are being asked how the poet presents the effects of the season of autumn. When we break this down, we can see that the question wants us to discuss the ways in which the poet shows the reader the impact that autumn has, as opposed to simply what it looks like. So now, in relation to the question, let's look at the title. The title is directly related to the subject of autumn, but being just one word creates quite an abrupt tone. It could have included more words, but instead it is written very much like a statement. We can also comment on how this abrupt tone complements the frantic tone of the poem. Now, AO1 requires you to explore different interpretations, so we want to start thinking about what are the meanings we can infer in relation to the question. Firstly, the negative language and tone suggests that the speaker doesn't like autumn. It's an odd season not to like, so it makes us, the reader, question why. Let's come up with some ideas. Maybe it conjures up bad memories. Maybe something traumatic has happened during this season in the speaker's life. If we assume that the poet is the speaker, maybe he was unhappy or angry about something when he wrote the poem, and perhaps this is what influenced his tone. An interesting observation is that despite the season coming around annually, we sense that it takes the poet by surprise. We also see the word dead being used. We could infer that perhaps the speaker experienced death in his life during this season. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, autumn is an interesting season to choose to describe so negatively. In poetry, we often see winter being used to represent bleakness. So given that autumn comes before winter, maybe this poem indicates that the speaker is experiencing anger that precedes, that is to come before, the bleakness he is yet to experience. Since there are no marks for simply identifying writers' methods, we need to now look at what impact they have. Earlier, I identified the simile, where autumn is compared to an experienced robber. With that in mind, I also mentioned that the robber could be an extended metaphor. When looking at the impact, we could say that it gives the effects of autumn significant importance. Maybe it's because the season has significant meaning to the poet. Perhaps it conjures memories. If this is the case, we can infer that these memories are negative. We also looked at alliteration, and this can be linked to the poem by saying that it reflects the poet's harsh perception of the season. The repetition of the words "the wind" intensifies this impact. Wind is quite an aggressive sound as opposed to, say, a breeze. I also identified some sibilance, which is quite onomatopoeic, and it reminds us of the whistle of the wind. And finally, the juxtaposition of placid with rage builds to the angry tone that the poem ends on, which makes it even more impactful. We could interpret that perhaps the speaker is conveying that his feeling of rage is out of character, since normally he is a placid person. We also need to look at the impact of the structure. We can see that it's hard to establish a consistent rhyme scheme, And when we look closely, the lack of punctuation creates a frantic rhythm. These mimic the natural language and creates a panicked tone. Also, the lack of there being a controlled structure might reflect how out of control the speaker feels about the weather or the season, and this might represent some personal feelings. When looking at the form, we can see that it's consistent with what we have inferred about the structure, in that it's consistent with creating a sense of the poem being an emotional outpouring. Finally, we want to look at the impact of the language features. Here are the ones that we have identified. If you want, you can press pause to have a go at analysing what impact they have. If you want some ideas, then keep watching. Looking at just some of them, we can see that the figurative language serves to reinforce the intensity of the speaker's feelings. It also gives us a sense that the speaker is struggling to make us understand just how he feels, which is why he uses tools like similes and metaphors to help us empathise with him. The sensory descriptions draw the reader in. It is as though we can share the speaker's feelings. And the movement brings the poem to life. Finally, the simple and direct language creates a sense that his feelings are raw. And that brings me to the end of the steps for annotating an unseen poem in just 5 minutes. I realise that it seems like a lot, but that's only because I've explained each step and worked through an example. But the more you practice this, the faster you will get. In fact, as you become confident with this, you'll probably find yourself combining some of the steps, which will make this even faster. In the next video series, I'm going to show you how to construct a 24-mark answer, and we will look closely at the mark scheme so that you're confident in what the examiners will want from you. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.